Brilliant. And we are live. Hello and welcome to the NewsWhip Pulse. I'm your host, Paul Quigley, the CEO at NewsWhip. I'm being joined today by a very special guest, Michael Young, the Global Insights Manager at Ford. Michael, welcome to the Pulse.
It's great to be with you, Paul. Thank you.
So on the Pulse, as our regular viewers will know, we speak to innovators at the intersection of data, media, and communications. And recently we've spoken to Samsung about a framework for reputation management, about Pepsi using real time to inform their creators studio. We've spoken to McDonald's about real time data in strategic communications. So I'm really thrilled today because we've got a very concrete story to delve into today about real time data, communications, and the Ford 150. And it also involves a major news event. Now, before we get into it, I'd like to introduce our host. Michael has been the Global Insights Manager at Ford and actually has 15 years of experience leading teams in analytics in the automotive industry. So before we jump into anything else, Michael, can you tell us about your work, that of the Insights team? Even when was this team established and what are its goals?
Yeah, thanks, Paul. Yeah, so we actually got our start in 2007. It really started when the company brought in, we were in turnaround mode at that time, and we brought in Alan Mulally as our CEO. Alan was such a great business leader. He came from Boeing, and he was really an engineer at his core. And because Alan was an engineer, he was metrics driven, and it was a leader that was metrics driven like we've never seen previously. So one of the things that Alan brought over was something called business plan review. And essentially, it was a weekly meeting with the company's leadership, and the leaders were really tasked to show progress against their plan. And it wasn't sort of soft progress. You had to have hard metrics, right? And as we all know on this call, sort of this intersection of PR, and data is, for years, it was a discipline that was considered largely unmeasurable, right? Or a soft function, right? So, but that wasn't going to be good enough for a guy like Alan Mulally, right? So he says, I don't care. I need hard metrics, and I need you guys to show progress against your plan. So, it was really the kick that we needed, but it really got us started. And 14 years later, Paul, it's still the same goal, which is, we spend every day proving to the rest of the enterprise that PR can be measured and quantifying our value.
Amazing. And so the insights that you're generating are part of communications, and then they spread out more widely in the organization too.
Absolutely, yeah. So it's product, corporate, it's everything. We interface with, I think it's the inherent advantage of being in communications or in PR is you touch every part of the business, right? So, we work on metrics, reporting, analyses that touch HR, supplier relations, marketing, communications. I mean, pretty much every function in the company. And so, it's a variety of different things we work on, but absolutely, and I do think, you started with, 15 years, it is a rarity to be an in-house analyst. I've heard from some people in the field that it seems to be a growing field, which would make me really happy. I hope it grows. I think we need more in the corporate world. I think we need more in-house analysts, but, it's something I call being within the walls, right? As an in-house analyst, this, sort of being a Ford employee for 15 years, I've been able to develop relationships. I get invited to meetings that aren't even about metrics, or at that point don't even have the data component there. But you get, I always tell my team, just get a good understanding of what our leaders and what the business is talking about, in parallel with learning how to use our tools, becoming best in class in terms of our tool stack. Put the two together, you will always find a solution for these various needs.
I think that's brilliant, and I've been paying a lot of attention to this trend of brands developing more of this intelligence and insights capability in house, and I think I'd love to delve into the F-150 PowerBoost story, because I think it shows what a mature in-house kind of data and insights capability can bring in terms of kind of outcomes. So I'm going to just share we're sharing our screen here, and I think if we're going to open with a story that really begins with the Texas power grid failing back in February 2021. of this year, and the remarkable story the F150 played. So maybe you can tell us a little bit more about how this came about and remind everyone of what the situation was back in February.
Yeah. So you're exactly right. It happened in February. So, just to give everybody some context, the state of Texas, in February, I believe, the average temperature is about 45 to 55 degrees. So this winter storm is such an anomaly. Temperatures hit low of 7 degrees. I think that's what, Paul, negative 13 Celsius, right? So, and for a state that is as southern as it is, frankly, never sees snow, and 3 to 5 inches of snow on the ground. Again, quite the anomaly, and really the winter storm was devastating. Snow and ice paralyzed the electric grid there, and unfortunately, people in the state of Texas were without power and water, for 2 weeks. So it was a tough situation.
Yeah, and this was a major news event too. Like even here in Ireland, yeah. I think that was being reported, and certainly I subscribed to US media, and it seemed to be the #1 story. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah. So this is how we sort of started with it too. We were watching it anyway. Just thinking about sort of risk, to the business. But you can see how it sort of played out. In terms of that top left graph is sort of the media volume, and then sort of the social engagement below, So, what this told us too is not only, looking at volume, obviously this thing was growing at such a level, and we were obviously keeping our benchmarks in mind with national stories, and, looking at those volume numbers over time. It was really over indexing, but that engagement piece at the bottom there was proving or showing us too that people were sharing this story across social. It obviously, as you can see in sort of the news sequence, became very political, which sort of boosted the volume on that too. But it really lasted a couple weeks. You can see it was really in its heaviest sort of form the 17th through really the 22nd. And I noted the apex there, and it's actually that apex played an important part in the presentation I did to our leadership and the teams, because obviously we'll see it in a little bit, sort of bringing it into where we came into the story. But overall, you said it. It was really the biggest story in the United States for 2 to 3 days.
Yeah, and so can you tell us a bit about how Ford came into the story?
Yeah, it was really interesting. So I would love to tell you that we had some big data, machines and, processes running where, we were analyzing via NLP all the conversation, and the tool, forecasted that this was going to be a big trend and we were going to be pulled into the conversation, but really it wasn't that at all. It was quite manual. Our work is still art and science together, and the art was, we do a lot of monitoring. We do a lot of manual monitoring. So we use our tools quite a bit to do the automated piece, but we had some people that continually monitor the automotive forums. That's where you really get the voice of the customer. And in automotive, we're lucky. We got a lot of content to analyze. There's forums for every single product that we as Ford don't even own those forums, right? These are just passionate consumers sharing stories about their product. So we were monitoring, again, more in the manual sense, and came across some owners out of Texas who recently purchased what we call Power Boost F-150. It's our new truck. It's a hybrid. We have the gas version, but we also have a hybrid version. It's called the Power Boost. The Power Boost F-150 has a feature on it that is exclusive. No other automaker has it. It's called Pro Power Onboard Generator. So it's essentially a backup generator built into your truck, and you can see the pictures here. So you have a plug on the back in the cab, and it's basically a power generator. So what we saw a lot of trucks in Texas, and we're seeing good pickup on the hybrid too, and saw owners on these forums showing how they were powering their house using the Power Boost F-150s, and knew immediately that this is something we have to track.
Brilliant. And then let's talk a bit about what how you started tracking.
Yeah.
At the start, we were talking about insights being about showing the PR has value, but now you're using real-time insights to do something else. I think, to
Yeah,
tell about
yeah,
that.
yeah, exactly. Right. So, even though the process maybe didn't start with, sort of a big data predictive approach, doesn't mean we weren't using it. It's just we came in sort of after that. So, I was I was on the phone constantly with our PR lead, who, frankly, is very good at social media, knows sort of how to play these situations and sort of how to react. So him and I were going back and forth, talking about it, and he moved really quick on the PR side. It's really a lesson in PR. You know, he knew immediately that we were not going to tell the story. Ford was not going to tell the story. It's not appropriate, right? But the customer's telling the story is fine.
Mm-hmm.
But we also knew that it was a good idea to get that story in sort of a bigger, through a bigger lens, right? So our PR lead went to work, direct messaging these folks on these forums who were posting and asking, hey, would you be interested in sharing your story on a larger stage? All of them agreed. They all loved the idea. So our PR lead starts working with some media contacts. We go to the local papers here, Detroit Free Press, CNBC, a couple others, and sort of just get them aware of the story. And, it was brilliant, again, from a PR standpoint, because it sort of takes us out of the equation, puts a true human face on the story. It's the customers telling the story. And so, and it made the reporter's life, I feel, probably a lot easier in terms of, how to write the story, how to write the headline. I mean, it was, it's a good thing to have your customers tell your story. But so the Detroit Free Press writes the story, Paul, and that's where our job starts to really kick in. And again, I'm on the phone with our PR lead, it's Saturday, Sunday, every 2 hours. And what I'm doing is I'm watching this Free Press story. And typically I would argue against, especially in 2021, focusing your analytics around one story. But we could see that something was happening with this one story. We were tracking, obviously, on the Spike platform, looking at velocity, predicted interactions, looking at how fast this story was growing in a certain amount of time. The good news, too, is we pride ourselves on benchmarks, baselines. Everything has a baseline, whether we're comparing against competition or ourselves. So we know when the data sort of say something in terms of velocity, we know that it's, we know how to put it in context. And so I'm going back and forth with PR lead saying, hey, this thing's growing like I've never seen before, right? And so that was that first sort of data indication that we needed to really pay attention to what was happening.
Yeah. So this was, once the story was placed, you could see something off the chart beginning to happen.
Yeah, before you move off the slide, so as you remember, on sort of that general news context, they noted the apex. And that's the same here, right? So, yep. So if you look at that national scene, you sort of see where it peaked, and now you can sort of put it, so around that February 19th, right? So that's the peak of the national story. And so look where we come in, just about, I think that Free Press story ran midday on the 18th, so there's luck involved too, right? But, I can tell you that we were pushing really hard, sending the emails, talking to the leads of, hey, this story is resonating, and we had the analytics to prove it. And then it really shifted the actions of the business.
It's like, and I suppose with more of an insight spec, and you had enough context put around those numbers as well, right? Because you've been doing a lot of the pre-monitoring of this. You could see that there was a peaking story, and that the role that Ford was playing in it was quickly becoming huge within it.
It was different, and you could see it, and the analytics proved it.
To explain to viewers who aren't Spike users, what we're looking at in the top graph there is media engagements. This is the number of outlets picking up the story about the F-150, and you can see that's on an axis of up to 40 publications picking it up per hour, because this is hourly data. And then you can see on the lower graph up to 30,000 people engaging. That means sharing, commenting on this per hour as well at the higher moments. So maybe you can tell us a bit more. We can dig into those graphs and see what was driving that.
Yeah, and again, this it's a strange one because we spend so much time, Paul, obviously looking at the trends of the big data inputs and sort of the indexes of having all of our tools input into sort of these bigger indexes, with sort of that data-driven approach. But again, a lot of the early analytics were around really specific publications and specific stories. But it was that little bit of luck, an amazing story, a human-focused story, little bit of luck and timing, right? So we'll go back to those two graphs and think about timing. Timing's everything, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we knew that, and we were watching. Yep, I mean it's all timing with that apex, right? Where that story at that point nationally was the biggest story in America, right? And one could argue, well, it still makes it hard to sort of break through, right? Frenetic news environment, things changing so quickly, but it worked where we caught the crest, and our story was as good as any other story that was out there in terms of help, right? And that's, again, I just want to be clear about that was the important piece, was that yes, there was innovation, there was a lot to tell, but we wanted to really be sensitive and make sure that we weren't sort of driving the story. But if you want to go back to that slide, Paul, so it's again, it's that Detroit Free Press story. That's where it really started. Watching that engagement, I think in terms of our baselines, I think it was something like 150% higher than a normal story that you would see in the first 2 hours. It kept growing the first 18 hours,
Mm-hmm.
where it was 300% higher. So you can see that first. So to your point, the white lines indicate how these individual publications and stories contributed to the overall. The purple line is sort of the overall Ford story and the engagement. The white line shows the engagement for these particular sources. So, it's that Detroit Free Press story that sets it off. They've done great work, by the way, on their analytics and making sure that their stories don't just stay in Detroit. So CNBC runs the story, and I don't know exactly how the sequence works, but really one of the other big turning points was the Apple News. So Apple News included in their feed late that night was the CNBC story. So you can see we got that late night bump there, which is the Free Press and CNBC, and then it sort of tails out. But then that next day, which is again, frenetic news environment, low attention span these days. Typically, you're lucky if you get 5 hours right of engagement around the story. The next day, you saw it kick right back up. People were sharing it, they were commenting it, and then more people were writing, right? And then the USA Today, same network as Detroit Free Press, they essentially pick up the story, they run it in USA Today, that gives you an extra bump, and then sort of in that third phase, local, right? Making sure that the local media, and I would argue that the local was the most important too, because one of the things we were doing in the business was we were actively figuring out how many of these PowerBoost F-150 hybrids that we had on the ground in Texas on dealer lots, so that if a homeless shelter or something, some kind of organization was in need, we could loan them out, right? So that's kind of what the business was doing in parallel to all this.
And before we move on from these graphs as well, you spoke, Michael, about moving fast and that being essential. And I think everyone wants to be able to move fast, and maybe especially for this audience, what was the role that kind of data and insight played in helping you move fast?
Well, I mean, it was just, the validation piece. I'm not, who knows how fast we would have moved without having those data-driven insights validating what we were saying, my team, which was, hey guys, this is different, right? I can tell you though I feel very confident that, being able to quantify it using the tools we had and showing the team how big this really was and how much it was over-indexing against an average or a norm, I think it clicked. It immediately clicked, and then it became the faster phone call to the dealer body group of how many do we have on the ground there, right? Mm-hmm. That kind of action. So, definitely, you always have to move fast. And You know, and again, it was really, I think the other thing too, I failed to mention it, but in that sort of more manual stage, you know, this is where you have to really rely on your savvy PR people if you're sort of at that quality or that manual level, right, in terms of identifying these things. But, you know, we knew also too that this story was a direct connection to our brand values.
Yeah.
So, you know, I would hope you move quick in that situation, right? And that's what we teach with the other work that I do on corporate reputation, right? We really try to arm our leadership and everybody with the data around corporate reputation, understand how we connect and resonate at that brand value side. So when you see something like this, you move quick, and then what my team does is we start assembling the data to validate and push even harder.
Perfect. And in fact, we can talk a little bit about this reputation elements to this story as well that are very positive too. There's one like you may not know this, Michael, but all of our original users of Newsfit Spike were in media. So, and I think our largest user base by number may still be US media. So this story would have come onto the dashboards of a lot of people in US media independently, as well as one of the big Texas storm stories.
I did know that, Paul, and it was it was what I liked about it from the get-go, because, you know, I mean, I was hearing stories about how newsrooms were really becoming pretty slick, right, in terms of pixel tracking, you know, readership, you know, and engagement, and then, you know, our leader in communications is you know, true blue journalist, comes from media, and so understands the value of a good headline and changing it when something's not working. So absolutely, we knew that, and it was big, you know, big selling point for us.
So let's talk about like what can you tell us about the table we're looking at here, Michael?
Yeah. So, you know, I'd just like to start by saying, you know, I think those of us in earned media and PR know how hard it is in 2021 to break through the mainstream. You know, it is, again, I use the word frenetic news environment. It's just one thing to the next. The volume is so massive. It's pretty tough to break through these days. And so what you're looking at is top 10 stories around the Texas storm theme. It's the overall theme. Again, it's not our forward focused themes, but sort of the national cover on the coverage. On the right side, you see the engagements. Now, Paul, I can't remember exactly when we cut this chart off, because again, we pulled this out of our presentation. I think this was probably 7 days. So it's, you know, it's probably a lot. These numbers are a lot different. I would hope better for us in terms of or placement on something like this. But again, it's sort of the national themes and then the engagement for those themes. And, you know, look at the media, look at the headlines, you know, politics, you know, sort of mainstream media, the main stories around the theme, you know. So this Detroit Free Press theme that sort of kicked us off, you can see that it was a top 10 theme nationally.
Yeah.
You know, which again is just quick validation that it broke through, right?
And for anyone who isn't familiar with the metrics here, we're looking at like thousands of social engagements, which are, you know, impressions are always a massive multiple of those again. And we are looking at stories about the winter storm overall, and it was a major political event. It had kind of global warming, political commentary about it, of course. There's AOC involved. There's, you know, big political voices and very kind of political themes that get a lot of engagement typically on social. And yet here is the Ford 150 story in the top 10 most engaged with stories, which is really remarkable for a global news event.
Yeah, it was amazing. We actually we talked to the reporter who covered the story, and she indicated that it was some of the biggest engagement that the Free Press has seen, like something over like the last 5-6 years. I mean, it was beating out, to your point, Paul, on the politics, like, you know, Trump focused stories, and you know, I mean, local stories about, you know, politicians. I mean, it sports even. So which, is a big driver of that engagement. I mean, they hadn't seen something like this in a long time. So again, it's just more, the metrics are important because they validate. When you tell somebody, they quantify. When you tell somebody, well, we really did a good job on it. So.
And it seems like there was a much wider social conversation about this as well, right? It's not just the earned.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And social measures, and those of us that use these tools, sometimes they can be a little high level, and you have to, again, you always have to have some kind of context to quantify. But that if you look at sort of the social mentions over time, those are really high numbers, especially with the fact that it's not a lot of media. Again, when we launched Lightning, F-150 Lightning or Mach-E, you're talking about much higher volume levels in terms of the media coverage, right? Which, conventional wisdom would say that you have a better chance of driving more engagement. This was the opposite, right? Where it was, that ratio of sort of your volume and potential reach to actual more behavioral metrics like engagement was really skewed towards the engagement piece of it. But these are good numbers. And so, one of the takeaways for us, a good lesson again, is if you look there, at the 17th, that's where that buzz really starts. Now, that's the organic piece.
Mm-hmm.
That pre-press story hasn't been written yet. So again, I would love to tell you a story about how the data caught this. But if you look at that line, what kind of thresholds, it's tough for a tool, it's tough for any type of analytic process to say, hey, there's something here, because, typically our thresholds work in volume based. There's nothing really outside of the norm there. But so what I've tried to task the team and for us to think about is, how do we get smarter in that 14th through the 17th period, right? How do we get more data driven? So we don't have to rely on a little bit of luck and sort of, overtly manually sort of looking through these. But so there is a lesson in that trend line, right?
Michael, we're going to be out of time in no time. First, if anyone who's here would like to pose a question, we may have a minute at the end, so please drop it into the chat where our producer Danielle will send it in. But I think we talk about reputation a lot in today's world, and this seems to have been a very positive experience for event for Board's reputation. Can you describe what we're seeing here in the next slide, Michael?
Yeah. So quickly, we do a lot of polling, a ton of polling, and so we have some good instruments where we can bring things in and out sort of in an omnibus fashion. So we ran a quick poll and just looked at awareness. We had 12%. We were locked in with Lowe's, which I was hoping for a little bit more. But Lowe's was very active too. They did some great stuff locally in Texas, and so it made sense. Some of the tech players we know in sort of our reputation research, they have a lot of equity, right, and spillover. So even if they weren't very active, it's sort of that overall reputational component spills over into other things. But overall, this was a healthy analytic for us, Paul.
And here's a nice thing to track as well, right?
Yeah, and I'm glad we at least got this in to close it. So, the thing that we were the most proud of, on the report is that it felt like a really good data storytelling deck. It felt like it covered, the funnel pretty well, top to bottom in terms of where we started, top of the funnel with the reach, and sort of keep drilling down the behavioral, attitudinal. And then we sort of ended here, which is, we have our internal web traffic to our F-150 vehicle homepage. And, we spent a lot of time trying to understand what marketing was doing, not around this theme, because we didn't do any marketing around this theme, but just overall, because that's how you sort of analyze, web traffic. It's so hard to control because there's so many earned and sort of paid things happening simultaneously. But we were able to validate the fact that the bumps that you see on the 19th, both at a national and Texas level, there wasn't anything out of the ordinary in terms of paid. So that was earned. And that is mid funnel. Those are lower in the funnel than we typically play in comms. And so it was nice to sort of kick that deck or end that deck off like that.
So it's been brilliant exploring this story with you, and I think dwelling on this story has been really illustrative, I hope, of what real-time data and insights can do for the comms team.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, we were due to talk about the Lightning, Maverick product launches.
Yeah.
We're flat out of time. So maybe this conversation.
You got to make these longer, Paul. You got to make these longer. I think we learned a lesson.
Yeah, I hate to be denying our audience a lot more potential insight about those things. So let's perhaps this is to be continued. And for people tuning in, our next Pulse is going to be on August 13th, and it's actually going to be a panel. And this time we're talking about the intersection of media and data and communications. It's going to be around misinformation, and we're going to have our head of research, Benedict Nicholson, talking to Sarah Brandt from NewsCard and Paul Resnick from the University of Michigan, who runs their index tracking misinformation as a percentage of overall web traffic. And we're going to talk a lot about really interesting and important things there. But Michael, this has been brilliant. Thank you so much for joining us today. And as I said, I hope this is to be continued.
Thanks, Paul.
Thank you for joining, everyone. Bye-bye.